Most people are terrified of walking alone, not because it's dangerous, but because it's silent. Silence exposes everything you've been distracting yourself from. Buddhism doesn't romanticize loneliness, and it doesn't glorify isolation. It tells a harder truth. Attachment is the root of suffering, and most people mistake attachment for connection. When you walk alone, you are not rejecting the world. You are finally seeing it clearly. Detachment is not abandonment. It is the return to yourself. Attachment sounds noble on the surface. People call it love, loyalty, commitment. But Buddhism cuts through the decoration and exposes the mechanism underneath. Attachment is not about caring for someone. It is about needing them to feel whole. And the moment need enters the picture, freedom disappears. The Buddha's insight was simple and brutal. Whatever you cling to gains power over you. When your happiness depends on another person's presence, behavior, approval, or consistency, you are no longer in control of your inner world. You've handed the steering wheel to someone else and called it connection. That is not love. That is dependence. Most people never question this because dependence feels comforting at first. It gives structure. It gives identity. I am needed. I belong. I matter because someone chooses me. But underneath that comfort is fear. Fear of silence. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of standing alone without a mirror to reflect worth back at you. Buddhism doesn't shame this fear, but it refuses to lie about it. Look closely at most relationships, and you'll see the same pattern repeating. People cling because they are afraid of emptiness. They tolerate disrespect because they fear abandonment. They shapeshift into what others expect because losing approval feels like losing oxygen. Over time, love turns into bargaining and connection turns into surveillance. Do you still care? Are you still here? Am I still enough? This constant checking is suffering, even when it's disguised as closeness. Walking alone interrupts this cycle at its root. When you choose solitude intentionally, you remove the external scaffolding that has been holding your emotional structure together. At first, it feels unstable. The mind panics because it has been trained to regulate itself through others. Validation becomes a drug, and solitude feels like withdrawal. Buddhism recognizes this discomfort as a necessary stage, not a failure. The pain isn't caused by being alone. It's caused by the loss of what you were leaning on. As you stay with that discomfort instead of escaping it, something important happens. You begin to see how often your emotions were reactions rather than choices. How often your sense of self was borrowed rather than discovered. When there is no one to impress, no one to please, no one to cling to, the mind has nowhere to hide. This is not peaceful at first. It is raw, but it is honest. This is where real strength begins to form. Outsourcing emotional stability is one of the most common and least questioned habits in modern life. People expect partners, friends, families, and even strangers to regulate their moods, reassure their insecurities, and anchor their identity. Buddhism calls this a fundamental misunderstanding. No external condition can provide lasting stability because all external conditions are impermanent. People change, ceilings fade, circumstances shift. Building your peace on what changes is guaranteeing future suffering. When you walk alone, you are forced to build stability internally. You learn to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to fix it. You learn that anxiety rises and falls on its own if you don't feed it. You learn that loneliness is a sensation, not a verdict. This rewires the nervous system. Instead of reacting automatically, you start observing. Instead of clinging, you start understanding. And understanding dissolves dependence. Needing others to tell you who you are is another subtle form of attachment. Praise becomes fuel. Criticism becomes poison. Identity turns into something negotiated socially, rather than grounded internally. Buddhism teaches that the self is not a fixed object to be defended, but a process to be observed. Solitude accelerates this realization. Without constant social feedback, the false self weakens. You stop defining yourself by roles, labels, and reflections. What remains is quieter, but far more stable. This is why walking alone often feels like losing yourself before finding yourself. The old identity was propped up by relationships, expectations, and emotional transactions. When those are removed, the structure collapses. But what collapses was never solid to begin with. Buddhism doesn't mourn this loss. It sees it as liberation. Strength, in this sense, has nothing to do with dominance or toughness. It is the strength of not being pulled apart by craving, the strength of not collapsing when someone leaves, the strength of not chasing validation to escape inner emptiness. When your peace is no longer rented from someone else, it cannot be revoked. No argument can steal it. No rejection can destroy it. No absence can threaten it. This doesn't mean you stop caring about people. It means you stop using them. Love without attachment is calmer, cleaner, and more honest. You can appreciate without clinging, connect without gripping, and let go without hatred. Buddhism does not teach withdrawal from life. It teaches freedom within it. Walking alone is the training ground for this freedom. It strips away emotional crutches and exposes the mechanics of suffering. It teaches you, through direct experience, that you are capable of standing without leaning. And once you know that, relationships stop being survival strategies and start becoming choices. That is the difference between dependence and love. And that is why strength begins the moment you stop renting your peace and start owning it. 2. Solitude reveals the real mind. Most people think they know their own mind. They don't. What they know is the version of their mind that performs in front of others. Buddhism is clear on this point. The mind you display socially is not the mind that governs your suffering. It is a curated surface. The real mind only reveals itself when there is no audience. When you are surrounded by people, the mind is constantly adjusting. It filters thoughts before they are spoken. It suppresses impulses that might be judged. It amplifies traits that might be rewarded. Even in close relationships, this performance never fully turns off. There is always an image to maintain, a role to play, a version of yourself that feels safer to present than the truth. This constant self-editing creates exhaustion, but because it's familiar, most people mistake it for normal life. Solitude removes the stage. When you are alone, there is no one to manage, no reactions to predict, no approval to seek. The mind is no longer busy performing outwardly, so it turns inward. This is where many people panic. Thoughts become louder. Emotions surface without warning. Old memories reappear. Regrets, fears, and unresolved questions rise to the surface. Buddhism does not see this as a problem. It sees it as the first honest moment you've had with yourself. Most people try to escape this moment immediately. They distract themselves with noise, screens, constant stimulation. Not because solitude is dangerous, but because it is revealing. The mind, when left alone, shows its habits clearly. You see how repetitive your thoughts are, how often the same worries replay, how frequently the mind clings to the past or rushes toward the future. This is uncomfortable because it shatters the illusion of control. Buddhism teaches mindfulness not as relaxation, but as observation without interference. Solitude makes this unavoidable. When there is nothing to distract you, you are forced to witness the mind as it actually behaves, not how you imagine it behaves. You see that thoughts arise on their own, that emotions appear without permission, that much of your inner life is automatic rather than chosen. This realization is unsettling, but it is also liberating. As long as you believe you are your thoughts, you are trapped by them. Every anxious idea feels like a command. Every negative judgment feels like truth. Solitude exposes the gap between awareness and thought. You begin to notice that thoughts come and go, even when you don't engage them. That emotions peak and fade if you don't resist or fuel them. This is not philosophy. It is direct experience, and it only becomes clear in silence. In social environments, this insight is almost impossible to reach. There is too much feedback, too much reaction, too much external movement. The mind stays reactive, bouncing between stimuli. Solitude slows everything down. It removes the constant input and allows patterns to become visible. Just like muddy water becomes clear when left undisturbed, the mind reveals its structure when it is no longer shaken by constant interaction. This is why walking alone feels intense at first. You are no longer buffered by distraction. You are face to face with yourself. Buddhism does not promise that this encounter will be pleasant. It promises that it will be truthful. And truth, unlike comfort, has the power to transform. As you continue to stay alone without escaping, something shifts. The initial chaos begins to settle, not because problems magically disappear, but because you stop reacting to every internal movement. You begin to recognize thoughts as events rather than identities. You see emotions as weather patterns rather than commands. This creates space, and space creates choice. This is the moment real control emerges. Control is not forcing the mind to be quiet. Buddhism rejects that idea entirely. Control is understanding the nature of the mind so deeply that it no longer dominates you. Solitude is the training ground for this understanding. It teaches patience. It teaches endurance. It teaches you that discomfort does not require immediate action. Most people are ruled by the urge to escape discomfort. Those who can sit with it develop an inner authority that cannot be shaken. Another truth solitude reveals is how much of your personality is reactive. Alone, you begin to notice how many of your opinions, desires, and emotional responses were shaped by comparison. Without others present, many impulses lose their urgency. You realize that much of what you wanted was socially conditioned, rather than internally necessary. This realization is humbling. It dismantles the illusion of a solid, independent ego. Buddhism considers this dismantling essential. The ego thrives on constant interaction. It needs opposition, admiration, and validation to stay alive. Solitude starves it. Without comparison, the ego weakens. Without performance, it loses relevance. What remains is not emptiness, but awareness, quiet, stable, and observant. This awareness becomes your anchor. When you return to the world after walking alone, you do not re-enter it the same way. You are less reactive, less easily provoked, less dependent on how others perceive you. You have seen the mind in its raw state and survived it. You know its tricks. You know its loops. This knowledge creates confidence, not the loud kind, but the grounded kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Solitude does not make you antisocial. It makes you self-aware. It doesn't isolate you from life. It reconnects you to it without distortion. When you can sit with your own mind without fleeing, you are no longer controlled by it. And that is why solitude, in Buddhism, is not an escape from reality. It is the clearest way to finally see it. 3. Detachment is control, not coldness. One of the biggest lies people believe is that detachment makes you cold, distant, or heartless. Buddhism completely dismantles this misunderstanding. Detachment is not emotional shutdown. It is emotional clarity. Coldness comes from suppression. Detachment comes from understanding. And the two are not just different, They are opposites. Most people think they are emotionally open, but what they really are is emotionally entangled. They confuse intensity with depth and attachment with care. They believe that if they stop gripping tightly, everything will fall apart. Buddhism points out the uncomfortable truth. Things fall apart precisely because of the grip. When you are attached, your emotions are reactive. Someone's tone changes, and your mood collapses. Someone pulls away, and anxiety takes over. Someone disapproves, and your sense of worth starts shaking. This is not sensitivity, this is loss of control. Attachment hands emotional authority to external conditions and then wonders why life feels unstable. Detachment takes that authority back. In Buddhism, detachment means seeing clearly that people, emotions, and situations are impermanent. Not intellectually but experientially. When you truly understand that everything changes, you stop demanding that it doesn't. This single shift transforms how you relate to others. You stop trying to freeze moments, secure guarantees, or extract certainty from what is fundamentally uncertain. This doesn't make you distant, it makes you calm. A detached person can listen without absorbing. They can care without clinging. They can love without fear of loss controlling their behavior. This is emotional control in its purest form, not domination, not numbness, but stability. You are no longer pulled violently by every emotional current because you understand the nature of the river. Most people resist attachment because they think it means not caring. In reality, attachment is what distorts care. When you are attached, you don't see people as they are. You see them as emotional anchors. You don't respond to situations, you react to threats. Fear quietly drives your behavior, even when you call it love. Buddhism exposes this without cruelty. It simply asks you to look. Are you responding to the present moment, or are you reacting to the fear of losing something you're clinging to? Walking alone trains this distinction. When you step away from constant emotional entanglement, you begin to notice how often your reactions were fueled by unconscious fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being replaced, fear of being unimportant. Detachment doesn't erase these fears overnight, but it stops them from running the system. You observe them instead of obeying them. This observation creates space. In that space, you realize something crucial. Emotions are not orders, they are signals. Attachment turns signals into commands. Detachment turns commands back into signals. This is where control lives. Not in suppressing emotion, but in understanding it well enough to choose your response. A detached person doesn't explode when disappointed. They don't collapse when rejected. They don't chase when ignored. Not because they feel nothing, but because they understand what is happening internally. They see the craving arise. They feel the urge to cling. And instead of acting it out, they let it pass. This ability is rare, and it is powerful. People who lack detachment are easy to manipulate. Their buttons are visible. Approval controls them. Disapproval destabilizes them. Silence unnerves them. Buddhism doesn't frame this as a moral failing, but as ignorance of the mind's mechanics. Once you understand these mechanics, manipulation loses its grip. Detachment also changes how you experience loss. Loss still hurts. Buddhism never denies this. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. Attachment turns pain into identity. I am broken. Detachment turns pain into experience. This hurts, and it will pass. The difference is enormous. One destroys you, the other strengthens you. This is why detachment is not coldness. Coldness is avoidance. Detachment is presence without possession. You are fully there, but you are not gripping. Fully open, but not dependent. Fully caring, but not controlled. Walking alone sharpens this ability because it removes emotional noise. Without constant relational stimulation, you learn to regulate internally. You stop looking outward every time something shifts inside you. You sit with it, you understand it. Over time, this creates an emotional steadiness that others can feel immediately. This steadiness is often misunderstood as distance. In reality, it is safety. People feel calmer around someone who is detached, because detached people are not needy. They are not demanding emotional reassurance. They are not constantly extracting validation. Their presence is grounded. They don't escalate conflict. They don't dramatize impermanence. They don't panic at change. This is control in its most refined form. Buddhism does not teach you to withdraw from relationships. It teaches you to enter them without losing yourselves. Detachment allows you to engage deeply without drowning, to care without consuming, to love without fear, turning love into a transaction. When you walk alone long enough, you stop confusing intensity with meaning. You stop equating attachment with depth. You realize that the strongest connections are not the tightest ones, but the calmest ones. And that is the paradox Buddhism reveals. The less you cling, the more present you become. The less you fear loss, the more freely you love. The more detached you are, the more control you have not over others, but over yourself. That is not coldness. That is mastery. 4. Walking alone destroys ego dependence. The ego survives on reflection. It needs other people the way fire needs oxygen. Without comparison, without recognition, without resistance or applause, it weakens. Buddhism does not treat the ego as an enemy to be crushed, but as an illusion to be seen through. And nothing exposes that illusion faster than walking alone. Most people believe their ego is their confidence, their personality, their strength. Buddhism says the opposite. The ego is the part of you that depends on being seen to feel real. It is the voice that asks, "How do I appear?" before asking, "What is true?" And as long as that voice is running your life, you are not free. When you are around others, the ego is constantly active. It compares your success to theirs. It measures your status. It tracks who has more influence, more attention, more validation. Even subtle interactions feed it. A glance, a tone, a reaction. The ego reads everything and builds a story. Better than, worse than, admired, ignored. This process is so constant that most people mistake it's a thinking. Walking alone interrupts this addiction. When there is no one to compare yourself to, the ego loses its reference points. It doesn't know where it stands because there is no audience to rank you. At first, this feels uncomfortable. The ego panics because it interprets invisibility as death. Buddhism understands this panic. It is the fear of non-existence, not physical but psychological. That fear is exactly why solitude is powerful. As you stay alone, you begin to notice how much of your motivation was externally fueled. How many goals were about proving rather than becoming? How many opinions were shaped by opposition rather than understanding? Without others present, these drives lose intensity. Not because you are weaker, but because the illusion is thinning. This is where many people quit solitude. They return to noise, not because they found peace, but because the ego felt threatened. Buddhism would say they turned away just before clarity, because once the ego weakens, something more stable emerges. Without ego dependence, actions become quieter but more precise. You stop acting to be seen and start acting because it aligns. You stop defending an image and start observing reality. This shift feels like losing ambition at first, but it isn't. It is losing false ambition, the kind fueled by comparison, insecurity, and borrowed identity. The ego thrives on being someone. Buddhism points out that this someone is constantly changing. Today confident, tomorrow insecure. Today admired, tomorrow ignored. Walking alone exposes this instability. Without social reinforcement, the sense of a fixed self begins to dissolve. This can feel disorienting, but it is also deeply relieving. You no longer have to maintain a character. When the ego loosens its grip, you stop narrating your life as a performance. There is less inner commentary, less self-judgment, less need to justify every thought and action. This silence is not emptiness, it is space, and space allows awareness to function without distortion. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from identification. This is me, this defines me, this threatens me. Ego dependence is built entirely on identification. Walking alone gives you distance from it. You begin to see thoughts as thoughts, emotions as emotions, roles as temporary functions, rather than permanent identities. This distance is strength. A person who is not dependent on ego is difficult to provoke. Insults don't land the same way. Praise doesn't intoxicate. Failure doesn't collapse the self. Success doesn't inflate it. This does not mean the person is indifferent. It means their center of gravity is internal rather than external. Most people live externally. Their mood depends on reactions. Their confidence depends on feedback. Their sense of worth depends on comparison. Buddhism considers this a fragile way to live. Walking alone rebuilds the foundation from the inside. Another uncomfortable truth Solitude reveals is how much of the ego is defensive. Many arguments, ambitions, and emotional reactions exist not because they are necessary, but because the ego feels threatened. Alone, these threats disappear. There is nothing to defend, no image to protect, no status to maintain. This allows the nervous system to relax in a way social environments rarely permit. As the ego relaxes, humility naturally emerges. Not self-deprecation, but realism. You see yourself without exaggeration. Strengths are seen clearly. Weaknesses are acknowledged without drama. Buddhism values this clarity because it allows growth without self-hatred and confidence without arrogance. Walking alone also exposes how ego dependence fuels suffering in relationships. When ego is involved, interactions become negotiations of worth. Disagreements feel like attacks. Differences feel like rejection. Detachment from ego allows relationships to be experienced as exchanges rather than battlegrounds. Ironically, this makes you more grounded in the world, not less. People often fear that losing ego will make them passive or invisible. Buddhism argues the opposite. When ego no longer consumes energy, awareness becomes sharper, actions become cleaner, presence becomes stronger. Others may not be able to label what changed, but they feel it. There is less friction, less neediness, less posturing. Walking alone is the training that makes this possible. It strips away the mirrors the ego relies on. It forces you to stand without reflection. At first, this feels like standing in darkness. But over time, you realize you don't need mirrors to exist. The deepest form of confidence does not come from being admired. It comes from being unthreatened by obscurity. When you can walk alone without feeling diminished, the ego has lost its hold. Buddhism does not promise that ego will disappear completely. It promises that you will stop being owned by it. And that shift changes everything. When ego dependence ends, you are no longer driven by comparison. You move at your own pace. You choose based on alignment rather than validation. You speak when it is true, not when it is impressive. You walk alone not because you reject others, but because you no longer need them to confirm your existence. That is not isolation. That is inner sovereignty. 5. You stop seeking validation and start seeking truth. Validation is one of the most addictive substances in human life, and most people don't even realize they're dependent on it. Buddhism treats this dependency with ruthless clarity. The desire to be approved of, admired, agreed with, or reassured is not harmless. It quietly shapes your thoughts, your words, your decisions, and eventually, your entire life. When you walk alone, this addiction is exposed, and exposure is the beginning of freedom. Most people believe they want truth. In reality, they want comfort. They want confirmation that they are right, good, acceptable, and safe. Validation provides that confirmation temporarily. A compliment lifts the mood. Agreement creates relief. Attention creates a sense of existence. But Buddhism warns that anything that needs to be constantly renewed is not stable. Validation fades quickly, which is why the craving for it never ends. As long as you are surrounded by people, validation is always available in some form. Even disagreement feeds it, because the ego still feels engaged. Walking alone removes this supply. There is no audience to reassure you, no one to applaud your opinions, no one to immediately confirm your worth. At first, this feels unsettling, even painful. The mind starts asking questions it never had to face before. Am I still valuable if no one is watching? Do my thoughts matter if no one agrees? Who am I without feedback? Buddhism does not rush to answer these questions. It asks you to sit with them. In solitude, you begin to see how much of your identity was negotiated socially. Opinions softened to avoid conflict. Beliefs exaggerated to gain approval. Silence chosen not out of wisdom, but fear. When validation disappears, these compromises become obvious. You notice how often you were saying what was acceptable rather than what was true. This realization can be uncomfortable because it exposes self-betrayal. Truth, unlike validation, does not feel immediately rewarding. It can feel isolating. It can challenge beliefs you've relied on. It can dismantle narratives that kept you comfortable. Buddhism prioritizes truth, not because it feels good, but because it ends suffering at its root. Validation soothes symptoms. Truth changes structure. Walking alone trains you to tolerate the discomfort of truth. Without constant social reinforcement, you are forced to examine your thoughts more carefully. You start asking different questions. Not, will this be liked? But, is this accurate? Not, how will this look? But, is this aligned? This shift is subtle but profound. It moves your center of gravity inward. Decisions stop being negotiated externally and start being grounded internally. This is where real integrity forms. Integrity is not moral perfection. It is consistency between what you see and how you live. Validation encourages performance. Truth demands alignment. When you walk alone long enough, you notice when your actions contradict your understanding. Without the distraction of pleasing others, these contradictions become harder to ignore. Buddhism sees this awareness as a gift, not a punishment. Another illusion that dissolves in solitude is the belief that agreement equals correctness. In groups, consensus often replaces clarity. Ideas feel true because they are shared, not because they are examined. Walking alone breaks this spell. You are no longer carried by collective momentum. You have to stand with your understanding, even when it feels uncertain. This uncertainty is important. Buddhism does not encourage blind certainty. It encourages direct seeing. In solitude, you learn to sit with not knowing without rushing to fill the gap with borrowed beliefs. This patience sharpens perception. You become less reactive to opinions and more attentive to experience. Validation also creates subtle fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being rejected, fear of standing apart. This fear keeps many people silent when they should speak and agreeable when they should resist. Walking alone weakens this fear because you become familiar with standing without support. You realize that disapproval is survivable. Silence is survivable. Disagreement is survivable. Once this is understood, truth becomes less threatening. Buddhism teaches that craving leads to suffering. Validation is a craving. It pulls attention outward and creates dependence. Truth pulls attention inward and creates stability. One fluctuates constantly. The other deepens over time. When you stop seeking validation, you don't become arrogant. You become grounded. You no longer need to announce your views loudly or defend them aggressively. You can hold them quietly, revising them when needed. This makes your presence different. People who seek validation are restless. They argue to win. They speak to impress. They listen only to respond. People who seek truth move differently. They listen more than they speak. They are not in a hurry to be understood. They are willing to change their mind without feeling diminished. Buddhism values this flexibility because it reflects non-attachment to ego. Walking alone also reveals how validation distorts motivation. Many goals are pursued not because they are meaningful, but because they are admired. Without an audience, these goals lose their shine. This can feel like losing direction, but it is actually losing illusion. What remains are goals that still matter when no one is watching. These are the only ones worth pursuing. Over time, solitude rewires your relationship with approval. Praise no longer intoxicates you. Criticism no longer defines you. You can receive both without losing balance. This emotional neutrality is not indifference, it is maturity. You care about accuracy more than applause, alignment more than attention. Buddhism does not promise that seeking truth will make life easier. It promises it will make life clearer, and clarity reduces unnecessary suffering. When you stop chasing validation, your energy is no longer scattered across opinions and reactions. It gathers, it stabilizes, it strengthens. Walking alone is the condition that makes this possible. It removes the constant temptation to perform. It forces you to confront what you actually believe, value, and understand. And once truth becomes your reference point, validation loses its power. At that point, you are no longer moved by approval or crushed by rejection. You are guided by something far more reliable, direct understanding. And that is a strength most people never develop because they are too busy being seen to actually see. 6. Impermanence makes you unbreakable. Most people don't suffer because things change. They suffer because they expect things not to. Buddhism identifies this misunderstanding as one of the deepest sources of human pain. Everything changes: relationships, emotions, health, identity, circumstances. This is not a philosophical idea in Buddhism, it is a lived reality. Yet most people live as if permanence is guaranteed, and when reality contradicts that expectation, they collapse. Walking alone forces you to confront impermanence directly, without distractions. When you are constantly surrounded by people, routines, and noise, change is buffered, loss is softened by replacement, discomfort is numbed by stimulation. Buddhism does not consider this resilience. It considers it avoidance. True resilience comes from seeing impermanence clearly and standing anyway. Impermanence terrifies the ego because the ego wants continuity. It wants certainty. It wants assurances that things will stay the same. This is why people cling so tightly to relationships, roles, identities, and beliefs. They are trying to freeze what cannot be frozen. Buddhism does not condemn this impulse, it explains it. Clinging is a response to fear, but it also guarantees suffering. Walking alone removes the illusion that something external will stabilize you forever. In solitude, You begin to notice how everything inside you is also changing. Moods shift without explanation. Motivation rises and falls. Confidence appears one day and disappears the next. This observation is unsettling at first because it dismantles the idea of a solid self. But Buddhism teaches that this fluidity is not a weakness. It is the nature of reality. The problem is not that things change. The problem is resisting that change. Most emotional pain is not caused by loss itself, but by the refusal to accept loss. When something ends, the mind keeps replaying how it should have stayed. When a relationship changes, the ego demands explanations and guarantees. Buddhism shows that this resistance turns pain into prolonged suffering. Walking alone teaches you to let experiences arise and pass without clinging to their permanence. This is where unbreakability begins. An unbreakable person is not someone who never feels pain. It is someone who does not collapse under it. Impermanence trains this strength. When you truly understand that everything passes, you stop treating discomfort as a threat. You stop panicking when things shift. You stop interpreting endings as failures. You experience loss fully, but you do not build your identity around it. This understanding changes how you experience fear. Fear often comes from imagining a future where something essential is missing. Walking alone teaches you that you have already survived countless changes. You have already lived through endings you once thought were unbearable. Buddhism encourages this reflection not to minimize pain, but to contextualize it. You realize that you are not as fragile as you believed. Impermanence also dismantles attachment to emotional states. Many people chase happiness and run from sadness as if one should last and the other should disappear. Buddhism teaches that both are temporary. Walking alone allows you to observe this directly. You watch joy arise and fade. You watch sadness do the same. This observation removes urgency. You stop demanding that life feel a certain way all the time. This emotional flexibility is power. People who don't understand impermanence cling to good moments and resist bad ones. This makes them anxious during joy and hopeless during pain. People who understand impermanence enjoy what is present without fear of losing it and endure what is difficult without believing it will last forever. Walking alone accelerates this understanding because there is nothing to distract you from the natural rhythm of experience. Another truth impermanence reveals is that identity itself is unstable. Who you are today is not who you were 5 years ago. It will not be who you are 5 years from now. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises when you try to defend an identity as if it were permanent. Solitude exposes how often you were protecting an image rather than living honestly. When you stop clinging to a fixed identity, failure loses its power. Criticism loses its sting. Change becomes information rather than a threat. You adapt faster because you are not busy defending who you think you are supposed to be. Walking alone also changes how you experience relationships. You stop expecting people to fulfill roles forever. You stop demanding consistency from what is naturally fluid. This does not make you detached in a cold way. It makes you realistic. You appreciate people as they are in the moment, without burdening them with impossible expectations. Buddhism teaches that acceptance of impermanence leads to peace, not passivity. Acceptance does not mean giving up. It means responding to reality instead of fighting it. Walking alone sharpens this skill. Without constant reassurance, you learn to meet uncertainty without panic. Over time, impermanence becomes a source of strength rather than fear. You realize that no emotional state can trap you permanently. No loss defines you forever. No situation has absolute authority over your inner life. This does not eliminate pain, but it prevents despair. You feel deeply without drowning. You grieve without collapsing. You change without losing your center. This is why impermanence makes you unbreakable, not because nothing hurts, but because nothing owns you. You stop demanding guarantees from a world that offers none. You stop clinging to what must eventually pass. And in doing so, you gain a freedom that most people never experience. Walking alone teaches you this lesson not through theory, but through direct exposure. You stand in uncertainty and discover that you are still standing. You watch things fall away and realize you are not destroyed. This quiet realization builds an inner confidence that does not depend on circumstances. When you no longer expect permanence, you stop being shocked by change. When you stop being shocked by change, life stops breaking you. That is not emotional numbness. That is resilience grounded in reality. 7. Returning to yourself is the highest discipline. Most people think discipline is about force. Forcing yourself to wake up earlier, forcing productivity, forcing control over habits, impulses, and outcomes. Buddhism offers a radically different definition. Discipline is not force. Discipline is sustained awareness. And there is no greater discipline than returning to yourself again and again without escaping. Walking alone exposes how undisciplined the mind actually is. When there is no structure imposed from the outside, no expectations to meet, no social pressure to perform, the mind reveals its habits clearly. It drifts, it avoids, it seeks stimulation, it resists silence. Most people mistake busyness for discipline. In solitude, that illusion collapses. You see how quickly attention fragments and how often the mind runs from discomfort. Buddhism does not shame this. It trains you to observe it. Returning to yourself means bringing attention back to the present moment, repeatedly, without judgment. This sounds simple, but it is brutally difficult. The mind prefers distraction because distraction numbs awareness. Awareness demands honesty. Walking alone removes many external distractions, forcing you to confront how restless and reactive the mind has become. This is where real discipline begins. Discipline in Buddhism is not about controlling the mind like an enemy. It is about understanding it like a system. When you notice how craving pulls attention outward and aversion pushes it away, you stop blindly obeying both. You learn to pause, to feel urges without acting on them, to sit with discomfort without immediately fixing it. This ability is rare because it requires patience without reward. Returning to yourself also means withdrawing energy from endless external seeking. Most people live outwardly. They look to achievements, relationships, opinions, and stimulation to define meaning. Buddhism teaches that this outward orientation never satisfies because it is unstable. Walking alone reverses this orientation. Attention turns inward, not to indulge the self, but to understand experience directly. This inward turn is often mistaken for selfishness. It is not. It is responsibility. When you return to yourself, you stop blaming the world for your inner state. You stop expecting circumstances to regulate your emotions. You take ownership of your reactions. This is not control in the rigid sense, but responsibility in the deepest sense. Buddhism considers this maturity. Another layer of this discipline is consistency. Returning to yourself is not a single realization. It is a continuous practice. The mind wanders, attachment returns, ego resurfaces. Distraction pulls you away. Discipline is noticing this and returning again without frustration. Each return strengthens awareness. Each return weakens unconscious habit. Walking alone accelerates this process because there is less external noise to mask inner patterns. You begin to notice subtle impulses that previously went unnoticed. The urge to check something, the urge to avoid silence, the urge to fill space. Observing these impulses without acting on them builds inner strength that no external discipline can match. This strength is quiet but absolute. People who cannot be alone rely on structure imposed from outside: rules, routines, pressure, and accountability. These can be useful, but they collapse when the environment changes. The discipline cultivated by returning to yourself is internal. It travels with you. It does not depend on conditions. Buddhism values this because it is resilient. Returning to yourself also means reconnecting with direct experience. You begin to feel sensations without labeling them immediately. You notice breath, posture, tension, and relaxation. This grounding pulls attention out of endless mental loops and anchors it in the present. Over time, this presence becomes your default state rather than an effort. This is mastery without force. Another truth this discipline reveals is how often the mind seeks extremes: overworking, overindulging, overthinking. Buddhism calls this imbalance. Returning to yourself naturally restores balance because awareness corrects excess. You feel when something is too much. You sense when rest is needed. You notice when effort turns into compulsion. Walking alone sharpens this sensitivity. Without social momentum pushing you forward, you become more attuned to internal signals. This does not make you weaker. It makes your actions more precise. You move with intention rather than impulse. The highest discipline is not rigidity, it is alignment. When you return to yourself consistently, actions begin to align with understanding. You say less, but what you say carries weight. You do less, but what you do is deliberate. You are no longer scattered across expectations and distractions. Your energy is gathered. Buddhism does not glorify isolation for its own sake. Walking alone is a means, not an end. The end is inner sovereignty, the ability to engage with the world without being consumed by it, to act without losing awareness, to care without attachment. Returning to yourself is the discipline that makes this possible. It is choosing presence over escape, truth over comfort, awareness over habit. Again and again, without applause, without recognition, without shortcuts. Most people avoid this discipline because it offers no immediate reward, no validation, no visible status, but its effects are undeniable. Calm under pressure, clarity in confusion, stability in change. These are the marks of someone who has returned to themselves. Walking alone teaches this lesson through experience. You are stripped of distractions and left with what remains. If you can stay, observe, and return without running, you develop a strength that does not depend on circumstances. That is why returning to yourself is the highest discipline, not because it is dramatic, but because it is relentless. 8. Silence is where wisdom forms. Most people are uncomfortable with silence, not because silence is empty, but because it is honest. Noise gives the illusion of progress. Conversation gives the illusion of understanding. Opinions give the illusion of wisdom. Buddhism dismantles these illusions one by one and replaces them with something far less glamorous and far more powerful: silence. Walking alone introduces you to this silence, whether you want it or not. At first, silence feels awkward. The mind rushes to fill it with thoughts, memories, plans, worries. This is not accidental. The mind is conditioned to stay busy because busyness prevents insight. When there is constant input, nothing is fully processed. Buddhism teaches that wisdom does not arise from accumulation, but from digestion. Silence is the condition that allows digestion to happen. Most people confuse talking with knowing. They repeat ideas they've absorbed from others and mistake familiarity for understanding. Silence strips this away. When there is no conversation to lean on, no reactions to bounce off, your thoughts must stand on their own. Weak ideas collapse quickly in silence. Unexamined beliefs lose confidence. What remains is what you have actually seen for yourself. This is why silence feels threatening to the ego. The ego wants expression, it wants recognition, it wants to be heard. Silence offers none of this. In silence, the ego has nothing to perform. Buddhism understands that wisdom begins only after the urge to perform subsides. When you stop rushing to speak, you start listening not just to others, but to reality itself. Walking alone teaches this listening gradually. Without constant conversation, you begin to notice subtleties that were always present but drowned out by noise. The rhythm of breath, the texture of emotion, the quiet signals of intuition. Buddhism does not mystify these observations. It treats them as natural outcomes of attention no longer being scattered. Silence also exposes how reactive most thinking is. In noisy environments, thoughts are constantly triggered by external stimuli. Someone speaks, and you respond. Someone disagrees, and you defend. Someone praises, and you inflate. Silence removes these triggers. The mind slows. Thoughts arise more deliberately. You begin to see the difference between reactive thinking and reflective understanding. This distinction is crucial. Reactive thinking is fast, loud, and repetitive. Reflective understanding is slow, quiet, and precise. Buddhism values the latter because it leads to insight rather than agitation. Walking alone gives reflective understanding room to develop. Without pressure to respond, you can sit with questions longer. You can allow answers to emerge rather than forcing conclusions. Another function of silence is integration. Experiences shape you, whether you acknowledge them or not. But without silence, they remain fragmented. Lessons are learned intellectually, but not embodied. Emotions are felt, but not understood. Silence allows experience to settle. It connects insight to behavior. This is why many realizations happen not during activity, but after it, in moments of quiet. Walking alone creates these moments naturally. Over time, silence changes your relationship with speech. You become less compelled to fill space, less anxious about pauses, less eager to assert opinions. This does not make you passive. It makes your words intentional. When you speak, it is because something needs to be said, not because silence made you uncomfortable. Buddhism sees this restraint as wisdom. Silence also teaches humility. In quiet, you realize how little you actually know, how often certainty was borrowed rather than earned. This humility is not self-doubt, it is openness. It allows learning without defensiveness. It allows correction without collapse. Walking alone cultivates this humility because there is no audience to impress with confidence. Another overlooked aspect of silence is emotional regulation. When emotions arise in silence, they are not immediately discharged through expression. You don't vent, you don't explain, you feel. This direct contact with emotion changes how it moves through you. Emotions complete their cycle instead of being reinforced through storytelling. Buddhism considers this essential for ending emotional suffering. Walking alone trains you to experience emotions without dramatizing them. Silence also reveals truth about motivation. When no one is watching and nothing is being said, you see why you act. Are you driven by fear, by habit, by craving? Without narrative and justification, motivations become visible. This clarity is uncomfortable, but invaluable. It allows conscious choice where there was previously automatic behavior. Wisdom, in Buddhism, is not cleverness. It is alignment with reality. Silence aligns you because it removes distortion. It strips away excess interpretation and brings you closer to direct experience. Walking alone extends this alignment over time. Silence stops being something you endure and becomes something you trust. Eventually, you realize something counterintuitive. Silence is not absence. It is fullness without clutter. From this fullness, wisdom emerges naturally, not as dramatic insight, but as steady understanding. You respond instead of react, you act instead of perform, you listen instead of assume. Others may not notice immediately, but they feel the difference. There is weight behind your presence. Walking alone teaches you this lesson slowly, without forcing it. Silence becomes familiar, then comfortable, then essential. And once silence no longer threatens you, confusion loses much of its power. That is why Buddhism places such importance on silence. Not because it is peaceful, but because it is precise. 9. When you stop escaping yourself, you become whole. Most people don't realize they are running, not from danger, not from responsibility, but from themselves. Buddhism sees this clearly. Much of human activity is avoidance disguised as living. Constant interaction, endless stimulation, relentless goals, emotional entanglements, all of it can become a way to avoid sitting with one's own inner state. Walking alone removes the escape routes. At first, this feels unbearable. When you stop escaping, everything you've been postponing rises to the surface. Old regrets, unprocessed grief, insecurity you buried under productivity, questions you avoided by staying busy. Buddhism does not interpret this as failure. It interprets it as honesty finally catching up with you. What you avoid does not disappear. It waits. Most people spend their lives outrunning this moment. They keep moving, talking, achieving, attaching, because stillness threatens to expose what hasn't been resolved. Walking alone shuts down the distractions. There is nowhere to redirect attention outward. You are left with yourself, unfiltered. This confrontation is uncomfortable because it dismantles the fantasy that you were already complete. But this is where wholeness begins. Wholeness, in Buddhism, does not mean perfection. It means integration. Nothing pushed away, nothing denied, nothing fragmented. When you stop escaping yourselves, you stop splitting your experience into acceptable and unacceptable parts. You allow thoughts to arise without panic, emotions to surface without suppression, memories to appear without immediate judgment. This allowance changes everything. Escaping creates inner division. One part of you feels something, another part tries to silence it. One part wants truth, another wants comfort. This internal conflict drains enormous energy. Buddhism teaches that suffering increases when experience is resisted. Walking alone reduces this resistance because avoidance is no longer possible. As you stay with yourself, something subtle happens. The intensity of inner turmoil begins to decrease, not because problems vanish, but because you stop fighting them. Thoughts lose their grip when they are seen clearly. Emotions soften when they are fully felt. Fear weakens when it is faced without distraction. This is not therapy, it is direct experience. Most people believe they need to fix themselves before they can feel whole. Buddhism teaches the opposite. Wholeness comes from stopping the constant attempt to escape what is already here. When nothing inside you is treated as an enemy, fragmentation ends. You are no longer at war with your own mind. Walking alone accelerates this process because it forces continuity. There is no switching roles, no performing different versions of yourself for different audiences. Over time, this consistency reveals something important. You don't need to become someone else to be complete. You need to stop abandoning yourself. Abandonment often looks like self-criticism, like constant distraction, like chasing external meaning while ignoring internal reality. Buddhism considers this abandonment the core wound. When you stop escaping, you begin repairing it not through affirmation, but through presence. Presence is the glue that creates wholeness. By staying present with whatever arises, you stop fragmenting your experience. The mind learns that it doesn't need to run to survive. This builds trust not in the world, but in your capacity to experience life without collapsing. That trust is stability. That stability is strength. Another consequence of stopping escape is authenticity. When you are no longer running from yourselves, you stop pretending with others. You don't need to exaggerate, hide, or conform as much. You speak more simply. You act more directly. Buddhism does not encourage bluntness for its own sake, but authenticity emerges naturally when inner conflict reduces. People sense this immediately, not because you announce it, but because your presence is no longer divided. Wholeness also changes how you experience pain. Pain is still pain, but it is no longer amplified by resistance. When you don't escape discomfort, it completes its cycle. It passes through instead of looping endlessly. Buddhism teaches that most suffering is pain multiplied by avoidance. Walking alone removes the multiplier. Stopping escape also ends the constant search for something missing. Many people feel incomplete and spend their lives trying to fill that feeling with relationships, success, or stimulation. Buddhism shows that the feeling of incompleteness is created by disconnection from oneself. When you return fully, the search quiets not because you found something new, but because you stopped losing yourself. This does not make life static, it makes it grounded. You still grow, you still change, but growth comes from clarity rather than lack. You act because something is aligned, not because something is missing. This distinction is crucial. One leads to exhaustion, the other leads to depth. Walking alone teaches you this lesson slowly and honestly. There is no shortcut, no dramatic breakthrough, just repeated moments of choosing presence over escape. Each time you stay instead of run, wholeness strengthens. Eventually, you realize something simple and unsettling. You were never broken. You were fragmented by avoidance. And the moment you stop escaping yourself, those fragments begin to reunite naturally. That is wholeness in Buddhism. Not becoming more, but abandoning less. 10. Walking alone makes you impossible to control. Control does not usually arrive through force. It arrives through dependence. Buddhism understands this deeply. Whoever controls your reactions controls you. Whoever can trigger your fear, desire, or insecurity can steer your behavior without touching you. Most people live under this invisible control and mistake it for normal life. Walking alone dismantles it. Control works because of attachment. If you need approval, you can be manipulated by praise and fear of rejection. If you fear abandonment, you can be controlled by withdrawal. If you crave belonging, you can be pressured into conformity. Buddhism does not frame this as weakness of character. It frames it as ignorance of how the mind works. When desires and fears remain unseen, they become handles others can grab. Walking alone removes those handles. In solitude, you begin to see what actually drives you. You notice which thoughts demand action and which emotions push for immediate relief. Without external influence, these forces become visible. Buddhism values this visibility because anything seen clearly loses much of its power. Control thrives in the unconscious. Awareness disrupts it. Most people believe freedom comes from having more options, more power, more influence. Buddhism teaches that freedom comes from fewer compulsions. When you are no longer compelled by fear, craving, or ego, external circumstances lose their leverage over you. Walking alone trains this internal freedom. At first, this training feels like deprivation. No reassurance, no applause, no constant feedback. The mind protests because it has relied on these inputs to regulate itself. Buddhism would say you are experiencing withdrawal from dependence. This stage is uncomfortable, but temporary. As you stay with it, something stabilizes. You stop reacting automatically. When someone criticizes you, you notice the impulse to defend, but you don't have to obey it. When someone praises you, you feel the pleasure without becoming inflated. When someone withdraws, you register the discomfort without chasing. This pause between stimulus and response is the core of freedom. Walking alone expands this pause. This is why walking alone makes you difficult to manipulate. Manipulation relies on predictability. If someone knows what you crave or fear, they can push the right button. When you are aware of these buttons and no longer ruled by them, control attempts fail. Buddhism does not encourage suspicion or paranoia. It encourages clarity. You see what is happening without becoming entangled. Another layer of control is internal. Most people are not controlled by others as much as they are controlled by their own mind. Urges, habits, and emotional reactions dictate behavior automatically. Walking alone exposes this internal tyranny. You see how often you were obeying impulses without choosing. As awareness grows, obedience decreases. You learn to feel desire without acting on it, to experience fear without retreating, to sit with uncertainty without rushing for certainty. Buddhism considers this the highest form of self-mastery, not domination of others, but liberation from internal compulsion. Walking alone also changes how power dynamics affect you. In social settings, status and hierarchy influence behavior subtly. People speak differently around authority. They adjust themselves unconsciously. Solitude weakens this conditioning. You become less reactive to status, less impressed by dominance, less intimidated by opinion. This is not arrogance. It is independence of perception. When you return to society, this independence remains. People sense it immediately, not because you announce it, but because you are no longer easily swayed. You don't over-explain, you don't overreact, you don't chase. This quiet steadiness makes others unsure how to control you because you don't follow expected scripts. Buddhism teaches that true power is non-reactivity, not indifference, but responsiveness without compulsion. Walking alone cultivates this power because it removes constant provocation. You practice being with yourself long enough that external stimuli lose their urgency. Another consequence of this freedom is ethical clarity. When you are not controlled by craving or fear, decisions become simpler. You are less likely to compromise values for approval, less likely to betray yourself to avoid discomfort. Buddhism sees ethical behavior not as moral obligation, but as natural outcome of awareness. When the mind is clear, harmful action becomes unattractive. Walking alone also ends the fear of standing apart. Many people comply not because they agree, but because they fear isolation. Once you are comfortable walking alone, this fear loses its grip. You can disagree without hostility, decline without guilt, leave without drama. This autonomy is deeply unsettling to systems built on conformity. This is why walking alone is quietly revolutionary. It does not make you rebellious. It makes you free. Free from being pulled by every opinion. Free from being driven by every desire. Free from being trapped by every fear. Buddhism does not promise control over life. It promises freedom within it. Over time, this freedom reshapes your presence. You move deliberately. You speak selectively. You act from clarity rather than pressure. Others may call this confidence, detachment, or even distance. In truth, it is sovereignty. Walking alone does not remove you from the world. It removes the world's ability to command you unconsciously. And once that command is broken, no one needs to dominate you because there is nothing left to grab. That is why walking alone makes you impossible to control. Not because you resist power, but because you no longer provide leverage. Walking alone was never about isolation. It was about reclaiming what was slowly given away, piece by piece, reaction by reaction, approval by approval. Buddhism never asked you to reject people or escape the world. It asked you to stop losing yourself inside it. When you detach from people, you are not becoming cold. You are becoming clear. Clear about what belongs to you and what does not. Clear about which sorts are yours and which were inherited. Clear about where your peace actually comes from. Most people never reach this clarity because they are too busy filling silence, chasing validation, and clinging to what cannot stay. Walking alone strips life down to what is essential. No roles to perform, no mirrors to check, no one to blame or impress. Just awareness meeting experience, moment by moment. In that space, fear weakens, ego loosens, control dissolves. And what remains is something most people never develop: inner authority. You no longer need others to regulate your emotions. You no longer panic when things change. You no longer fear silence or uncertainty. Loss still hurts, but it doesn't define you. Criticism still stings, but it doesn't control you. Praise still feels good, but it doesn't own you. This is not numbness, this is stability. Returning to yourself is not a destination, it is a discipline. One you practice every time you choose presence over escape, truth over comfort, awareness over habit, again and again, quietly, without applause. That is why it works. When you walk alone long enough, something irreversible happens. You stop searching for completion outside yourself. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop running from your own mind. And once that happens, you don't feel lonely anymore. You feel solid. Detachment doesn't make life smaller. It makes it honest. And honesty is where real strength lives. This is what it means to return to yourselves.